The sun was a malevolent eye, staring down at a land that knew no mercy. It baked the earth to a brittle crisp, turning vast plains into shimmering mirages and distant mesas into stoic, impassive giants. This was a place where survival was a daily conquest, and beauty, when it appeared, was often fleeting, treacherous. In such a crucible, what chance did innocence hold? What sanctuary could be found when the very wind carried the dust of broken hopes and forgotten dreams? This brutal frontier, sprawling and untamed, did not ask for pity. It demanded strength, devoured weakness, and sometimes, if the legends were true, it birthed its own kind of savior. May, a name that once meant beautiful plum blossom in a land far, far away, felt nothing but the dry, suffocating dust clinging to her tattered red cheongsam. Its once vibrant silk, now faded and torn, hung loosely on her frame, a cruel mockery of the life she had known. Her hands, calloused from years of toil but never meant for this, were bound roughly behind her, digging painfully into the rough wood of the wagon floor. The crude cart, rattling over sun-baked ruts, was less a conveyance and more a cage. Ahead, a trio of men, their faces scarred by sun and malice, rode with an easy cruelty that chilled May to her core. They were wolves in human skin, driven by the scent of desperation and the promise of profit. The leader, a wiry man with eyes like polished obsidian, occasionally glanced back, a sneer playing on his lips, assuring her of her fate without uttering a single word. Another, a hulking brute whose laugh echoed like loose stones in a dry well, kept jabbing the wagon's side with the butt of his rifle, as if to remind her of her captivity. May's jaw was set, a stubborn refusal to break, even as fear gnawed at her insides. Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of terror that seemed to mock the vast, silent indifference of the landscape. She was a single, fragile blossom ripped from her roots, cast adrift in a whirlwind of dust and danger. Yet deep within her, a tiny, defiant ember refused to be extinguished. Every jolting bump, every searing gust of wind, every crude jibe from her captors only solidified her resolve. She would not simply yield. The endless, shimmering horizon offered no comfort, only the stark reality of her plight. But in its boundless expanse, perhaps there was a sliver of hope, a direction to run, a place to hide, if only she could break free. She focused on the distant mountains, their peaks hazy against the blinding sky, imagining freedom beyond them. A foolish hope, perhaps, but one that kept the ember alive. The plains stretched out like a rumpled, sun-bleached blanket, each ripple and fold a testament to the land's ancient fury. Far behind the slow, plodding wagon, a single dark silhouette moved with the effortless grace of a predator. Silas rode his black stallion Midnight with the quiet intensity of a man carved from the very rock of the mountains he called home. His duster, sun-faded and dust-worn, blended seamlessly with the ochre landscape, making him almost invisible to the untrained eye. His face, etched with lines that spoke of hardship and solitude, was impassive. His eyes, however, missed nothing. He had seen the wagon hours ago, a smudge on the horizon, but it was the unnatural way the woman within moved, or rather didn't move, that had caught his attention. He was a shadow on the wind, a whisper of a legend to those who spoke of him in hushed tones, a man who saw too much, cared too little, and yet, sometimes, intervened. His past was a scar he carried deep, a wound that had taught him the bitter taste of loss and the futility of attachment. He preferred the company of silence and the unforgiving embrace of the wild, but something about the tattered red dress against the stark prairie had snagged his attention, a splash of desperate color in a world of muted browns and greens. He knew bandits when he saw them, recognized the cut of their saddles, the swagger in their ride. He could have turned away, let the desert claim its own, as it often did, But a nagging sense, a subtle tremor in the usually still waters of his resolve, kept him riding. He had no illusions of heroism, no grand designs, only a quiet, almost reluctant acknowledgment of injustice. He watched, calculating, his gaze sweeping the terrain, noting every rise, every depression, every potential ambush point. The men were sloppy, arrogant in their isolation, and that, Silas knew, was their weakness. He kept his distance, letting the sun crawl higher, letting their guard drop, letting the landscape work its slow, insidious magic of weariness upon them. The game, he decided, had just begun, though he still wasn't sure what prize he sought, or if he even sought one at all, beyond the simple restoration of a broken balance. The afternoon sun blazed relentlessly, baking the air until it shimmered above the cracked earth. The bandits, emboldened by the lack of pursuit and their growing thirst, grew careless. Their shouts, once boisterous, became irritable, their movements sluggish. May, stifling a cough that threatened to betray her, used the jostling of the wagon to subtly work at her bonds, the rough rope chafing her skin but offering a faint hope of loosening. Her hands, though trembling, moved with a quiet determination born of desperation. She knew her chances were slim, a whisper against the roaring wind, but despair was a luxury she could not afford. She focused on the small, insignificant details, the frayed strands of the rope, the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheel, the distant cry of a hawk circling high above. Every sensory input was a lifeline, keeping her anchored in the present, preventing her mind from spiraling into the abyss of what awaited her. The memory of her husband's gentle smile, of the quiet strength in his eyes, flickered at the edge of her consciousness, a beacon of what she had lost and what she fought to reclaim, even if only in spirit. She promised him, wherever he was, that she would not go meekly. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed across the vast emptiness, a sound that sliced through the droning hum of the heat. It wasn't thunder. It was too crisp, too deliberate. The bandit riding point, a scarred brute named Rafe, lurched in his saddle, his hat flying off as a bullet whizzed past his ear, kicking up a geyser of dirt and rock right beside his horse's hooves. "What in hell?" he bellowed, yanking on his reins, his face contorting in surprise and anger. The other two, the leader, Malachi, and the hulking brute, Jethro, instinctively drew their pistols, scanning the horizon. "Someone's out there," Jethro grunted, his eyes wide. Malachi, however, narrowed his obsidian gaze, a calculating glint in their depths. "Too far for a clean shot," he mused, "but close enough to send a message. We got company." He spurred his horse, pulling alongside the wagon. "Hold up," he commanded, his voice tight with sudden apprehension. May, her heart leaping into her throat, seized the moment. In the sudden halt and confusion, she strained against her bonds, feeling a sliver of give. The shot, precise and unyielding, was a beacon of impossible hope, a promise whispered by the wind. Silas, perched on a rocky outcrop a mile distant, lowered his rifle, the faint wisp of smoke curling from its barrel a silent testament to his marksmanship. He watched the bandits scatter, their brief moment of arrogant ease shattered. Malachi, the leader, was smarter than the others, his movements betraying a cunning born of experience. Silas appreciated a worthy opponent, even if his current motivations were purely for the sake of the woman in the wagon. He took a sip from his canteen, the cool water a stark contrast to the burning air, and then settled back, his eyes never leaving the scene. He wasn't interested in a full-blown firefight, not yet. He aimed to sow discord, to fray their nerves, to pick them apart piece by piece until their resolve crumbled. This land taught patience, and Silas had learned its lessons well. He moved, ghost-like, along the ridge, guiding Midnight with subtle pressure, keeping himself hidden, a constant unseen threat. The sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of fiery orange and blood red, a fitting backdrop for the drama unfolding. May, from her vantage point in the wagon, strained to see her unseen rescue. All she saw was the vast, empty expanse, yet the impact of the shot was undeniable. Her heart swelled with a mixture of terror and a fierce, unfamiliar elation. Someone had seen. Someone cared. It was a fragile ember of hope, but it flickered brighter than anything she had felt in days. "Who's out there?" Jethro roared, shaking his fist at the empty horizon. "Show yourself, coward!" Malachi ignored him, his gaze fixed on the distant ridge where the shot had originated. "No coward, Jethro," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Just smart and patient." He looked at May, a new glint of concern in his eyes. This complication was unwelcome, a threat to his easy bounty. He knew the type, a lone wolf, dangerous, unpredictable. May watched him, her gaze defiant, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, a crack in their seemingly impenetrable control. The heat still pressed down, but now it felt different, charged with an electric tension, the air thick with unspoken threats and the promise of impending violence. The stage was set, the players in place, and the sun, dipping lower, cast long, distorted shadows, transforming the familiar landscape into a theater of impending conflict. The bandits, now on edge, pressed onward, their previous arrogance replaced by a tense vigilance. Malachi, riding closer to the wagon, kept his eyes peeled, his hand never far from his holstered pistol. Jethro and Rafe, their nerves frayed, exchanged uneasy glances, muttering curses under their breath. May, her hands still chafed but now free from the ropes, huddled in the back of the wagon, clutching the loose strands of her cheongsam, her eyes darting between her captors and the vast, empty expanse. She knew the unseen rider was out there, a phantom protector, and that knowledge was a fragile shield against the terror that clawed at her. Suddenly a series of quick, sharp shots rang out, not aimed at the men, but at the horses of Jethro and Rafe, expertly clipping their legs without felling them, causing the animals to rear and plunge in sudden panic. Jethro, unprepared, was thrown violently from his saddle, landing with a sickening thud, his rifle skittering across the dry ground. Rafe, a better rider, managed to cling on, but his horse bolted, taking him further away from the main group. "Damn him!" Malachi snarled, his face contorting in a mask of fury. He drew his pistol, firing wildly into the distant shadows, a futile gesture against an unseen enemy. Silas, having dismounted and tied Midnight to a mesquite tree, moved like smoke through the rocky terrain, his rifle precise and deadly. He wasn't killing, not yet, only incapacitating, creating chaos. He watched Malachi, the leader, knowing he was the key. He moved closer, closing the distance, his silent approach masked by the escalating pandemonium. May, seizing the opportunity, scrambled to the side of the wagon, her heart thundering. Jethro, groaning, was attempting to push himself up, his eyes glazed with pain and rage. As he struggled, May spotted his abandoned rifle glinting in the fading sunlight just out of his reach. Without a thought, acting on pure instinct, she lunged, snatching up the heavy weapon. It was unwieldy, alien in her hands, but it represented power, agency. "Stop right there!" she cried, her voice surprisingly strong, though it trembled with adrenaline. Jethro froze, looking at her with a mixture of disbelief and renewed fury. Malachi, distracted by the chaos and the approaching unseen threat, whirled around, his eyes wide with shock at the sight of the woman, his captive, holding a rifle on his fallen man. "Put that down, girl!" he roared, raising his own pistol. But before he could fire, a shadow detached itself from the rocks. Silas stepped into view, his rifle already raised, aimed squarely at Malachi's chest. "Drop it," he commanded, his voice a low growl, devoid of emotion, yet carrying the weight of unyielding authority. The air crackled with tension, the brief standoff illuminated by the dying sun, two worlds colliding in a desperate struggle for freedom and survival. The standoff hung heavy in the air, a breath held before the storm. Malachi, his eyes narrowed, weighed his options, his gaze flicking from Silas's unwavering stare to the rifle in May's trembling hands. The woman, he realized with a bitter taste in his mouth, was no longer just a prize. She was a variable, an unexpected complication. Jethro, still sprawled on the ground, whimpered, his rage now tempered by fear as he stared down the barrel of May's rifle. Silas, a figure of stark authority against the fiery sunset, did not waver. "One move," he rasped, his voice cutting through the silence like a honed blade, "and you'll regret it." Malachi, sensing the unyielding resolve in the man's eyes, finally made his choice. With a guttural curse, he let his pistol drop, clattering against the dry earth. Silas gave a curt nod, his gaze never leaving Malachi. "The other one?" he asked, his eyes briefly flicking towards the direction Rafe had ridden off. Malachi, spitting dust, simply sneered. "He's gone. You got your pretty little doll, cowboy, but this ain't over." Silas ignored the taunt, his focus shifting to May. She still held the rifle, her knuckles white, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Her eyes, wide and luminous, met his, a silent question passing between them. He lowered his own rifle slightly, a subtle gesture of trust. "It's all right," he said, his voice softer now, though still gruff. "You can put it down." May hesitated for a moment, then, with a profound exhalation, lowered the heavy weapon, leaning it against the wagon wheel. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving her limbs feeling weak, her body trembling. Silas quickly disarmed Malachi, binding his hands securely with a length of rope. He then turned to Jethro, who was now trying to crawl away, and bound him as well, leaving them both incapacitated and furious under the watchful gaze of May. The immediate danger had passed, but the oppressive silence that followed was thick with the promise of more. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in a final defiant flourish of purples and deep oranges, a chilling desert wind began to stir, whispering secrets across the vast, empty expanse. Silas, his work done for the moment, helped May out of the wagon, his movements efficient, almost detached, yet surprisingly gentle. Her legs, stiff from being bound and shaken by the ordeal, nearly gave way, but his strong hand on her arm steadied her. She pulled her tattered cheongsam tighter around herself, shivering despite the lingering heat of the day. The air, once shimmering with oppressive warmth, now held a sharp, cold edge, a stark reminder of the wilderness's indifference. "You all right?" Silas asked, his voice low, his gaze sweeping the darkened horizon, not quite meeting hers. It wasn't a question of concern, not really, but a practical assessment. May nodded, her throat tight. "Yes," she managed, her voice a little hoarse. "Thank you." He grunted in response, a non-committal sound that spoke volumes of his stoic nature. He didn't ask her name, nor did he offer his own. He simply retrieved his horse, Midnight, a dark, powerful silhouette against the deepening twilight. "We can't stay here," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "They'll be back, or someone else will find them." May looked at the bound bandits, their curses and threats now muted by the encroaching darkness. She knew he was right. The taste of freedom, though new, was still precarious. She thought of the long journey ahead, the unknown dangers lurking in the vast, unforgiving landscape. Her rescuer was a man of few words, a formidable, solitary figure, and yet, in his presence, a strange sense of calm settled over her. He was a force of nature himself, as untamed and unpredictable as the land around them, but for the first time in days she felt a glimmer of safety. She watched as he efficiently gathered supplies, his movements economical and purposeful. He offered her a canteen and she drank deeply, the cool water a balm to her parched throat. "My name is May," she said softly, breaking the silence, offering the only thing she had to give. He paused, his back to her, then turned his head slightly. "Silas," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper, a name that seemed to blend with the rustling of the dry grass. It was not an invitation, but it wasn't a rejection either. The vastness of the desert night stretched before them, a canvas of stars beginning to emerge, each one a distant, cold promise. They were two strangers, bound by a violent encounter, now venturing into an uncertain future, the weight of the wilderness pressing down on them. Yet in that shared vulnerability, a fragile seed of something profound had been planted. The desert night enveloped them, a vast, indifferent cloak studded with 1,000,000 indifferent stars. Each pinprick of light seemed to mock their smallness, their fragility, in this boundless, unforgiving world. Silas led Midnight, May walking beside him, her exhaustion a heavy weight in her bones, but the fear of remaining rooted to the spot was a sharper spur. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of their boots on the gravelly earth, and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote, a sound that resonated with May's own lingering sorrow. She kept glancing at Silas, his silhouette dark and formidable against the fading starlight, a figure of stark, unyielding strength. He moved with the ease of a creature born of this wilderness, every step deliberate, every muscle coiled with latent power. She wondered about him, about the life he led, about the stories etched into the weary lines around his eyes. He had saved her, a stranger in a strange land, from a fate she dared not contemplate, and that act, devoid of fanfare or expectation, had forged a fragile, unexpected link between them. The wind, now colder, whipped her tattered cheongsam around her, a constant, irritating reminder of her displacement, her vulnerability. She pulled the thin fabric tighter, feeling a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Are you always alone?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the long silence, the words escaping before she could truly consider them. Silas paused, just for a moment, his broad shoulders tensing imperceptibly before he continued walking. "Most times," he grunted, his response clipped, offering no further explanation, no invitation to delve deeper. May accepted it, sensing the unspoken boundaries, the walls he had built around himself. Yet in that brief exchange, a seed of something new began to stir within her, a quiet curiosity that sought to understand the enigma of the man who walked beside her, her unexpected protector in this brutal, beautiful wasteland. She focused on the rhythm of their steps, the shared purpose of moving forward, away from the darkness behind, towards a future that was, in the vastness of the desert, as unknown and daunting as the man himself. As the pre-dawn glow began to bleed across the eastern sky, painting the distant peaks in hues of bruised purple and fiery gold, Silas brought them to a halt near a hidden cleft in the rock, where a trickle of pure, cold water seeped into a small, moss-lined basin. The air, still crisp with the night's chill, carried the scent of damp earth and sagebrush, a stark contrast to the dust and sweat that clung to them. He knelt, scooping water into his cupped hands, then offered it to May. She drank deeply, the coolness a shock to her parched throat, feeling the immediate surge of life it brought. Her eyes met his over the rim of his hands, and in that brief, unguarded moment, she saw not just the stoic survivor, but a flicker of something ancient, tired, yet profoundly human. It was a rare glimpse into the depths of a soul that had seen too much, endured too much. As Silas turned to scout the surroundings, May, though weary, found a small patch of wild onions clinging to the damp earth. Her hands, nimble despite their recent ordeal, carefully unearthed them. "These are good," she murmured, offering him a few, "for strength." Silas took them without a word, his gaze lingering on her hands, then on the resilient green shoots she held. He remembered the small, delicate hands of another, long ago, tending to a different kind of garden, a memory he usually kept locked away, buried beneath layers of hardened resolve. The sight of her, a woman displaced, stripped of everything, yet still finding a way to nurture life from the barren ground, stirred a quiet ache within him, a recognition of an enduring spirit that mirrored, in its own way, the stubborn will to survive that drove him. He watched her for a moment longer, observing her focused intensity, her quiet strength, and a flicker of admiration, unwelcome but undeniable, sparked within him. The world, in its vast, indifferent cruelty, had thrown them together, two disparate souls, but in the harsh light of a new day, a fragile, unspoken understanding began to bridge the chasm between them, hinting at a connection deeper than mere circumstance. Their respite was short-lived, for the desert held its grudges, and its predators were many. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, stark shadows across the rugged terrain, a distant dust cloud appeared on the horizon, growing steadily. Silas, ever vigilant, scanned the approaching menace, his jaw tightening. "Company," he stated, his voice a low growl, devoid of surprise, as if he had always expected the inevitable. May followed his gaze, her heart leaping into her throat. 3 riders, their forms becoming clearer with each passing minute, spurred their horses forward, riding with a reckless abandon that spoke of desperate pursuit. One of them, May recognized with a sickening lurch, was Rafe, the bandit who had escaped, his face contorted with vengeful fury. The others were equally menacing, their expressions grim, their purpose clear. They were not merely seeking to reclaim lost property. They sought retribution, a violent assertion of their dominance over this lawless land. "They're coming for me," May whispered, her voice laced with a renewed terror, but also a fierce, defiant resolve. Silas, however, simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the approaching figures, calculating angles, distances, strategies. "They're coming for us," he corrected, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his pistol, a silent promise of protection. The air crackled with a renewed tension, the brief calm shattered by the encroaching threat. Silas led May deeper into a labyrinth of sun-baked canyons, the narrow defiles offering both cover and potential traps. He moved with a swift predatory grace, May struggling to keep pace, her breath ragged in her chest, but her spirit unbowed. The pounding of hooves grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls, a relentless drumbeat of impending conflict. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but Silas was a force unto himself, a man whose intimate knowledge of the land was as potent a weapon as any rifle. He moved through the terrain with an almost supernatural intuition, a silent guardian leading his charge into the heart of the storm, ready to meet the wilderness's challenge with a fierce, unwavering determination that dared fate to test his resolve. The pursuit became a desperate, winding dance through the arid canyons, the bandits' shouts echoing, growing closer, then receding, as Silas expertly used the terrain to his advantage. May, moving with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, followed his every command, her eyes scanning the rocks, her senses heightened by the sheer proximity of danger. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but a strange calm had settled over her, born of absolute necessity and an unwavering trust in the man beside her. Suddenly, Silas halted, pushing May behind a large boulder. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low rumble, his eyes fixed on a narrow pass ahead. The canyon bottlenecked there, a perfect ambush point. Rafe, the leader of this vengeful trio, appeared, his face a mask of triumphant malice, his rifle raised. "Thought you could outrun us, cowboy," he sneered, his voice rasping. "Think again." But even as he spoke, Silas moved, a blur of motion, his rifle already at his shoulder. The shot cracked, precise and deadly, striking the ground just inches from Rafe's horse, causing the animal to rear violently. The distraction was all Silas needed. The other 2 bandits, caught off guard, were momentarily exposed. He fired again, a double tap that sent both men sprawling from their saddles, their surprised cries cut short. Rafe, seeing his men fall, let out a guttural roar, firing his rifle wildly, but Silas had already melted back into the shadows, a ghost in the rocks. May, peeking from behind the boulder, watched the scene unfold, a chilling thrill running through her veins. This man Silas was a tempest, a force of nature, protecting her with a silent ferocity that stirred something primal within her. Rafe, abandoned and cornered, seemed to shrink, his bravado evaporating in the face of Silas's ruthless efficiency. "It's over," Silas's voice cut through the silence, emerging from an unseen vantage point, a voice that was both a promise and a threat. Rafe, defeated, dropped his weapon, his gaze flicking wildly, desperate, knowing he was beaten. In that moment of reckoning, a profound shift occurred within May. She was no longer just a victim. She was a survivor, inextricably linked to this formidable, silent guardian, their fates now intertwined by the blood and dust of the unforgiving land. The sun, now a fiery orb dipping rapidly towards the western horizon, cast long, dramatic shadows across the canyon floor, painting the scene in hues of gold and crimson. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the lingering metallic tang of spilled blood. Silas, his face grim, quickly disarmed Rafe and tied his hands securely, leaving him to the mercy of the vast, unforgiving desert and the consequences of his actions. He moved with an almost ritualistic efficiency, his eyes betraying no emotion, yet May sensed the deep well of weariness beneath his stoic facade. She approached him cautiously, the heavy silence amplifying the pounding of her own heart. The immediate danger had passed, but the aftermath felt heavier, more resonant. "You saved me again," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, her eyes searching his, seeking something beyond the surface. He turned to her, his gaze finally meeting hers, and in the depths of his eyes she saw not emptiness, but a storm of emotions carefully held in check. Echoes of past battles, of losses endured, of a solitude chosen out of pain. "I told you it was for us," he replied, his voice rough, yet with an underlying cadence that betrayed a hint of something deeper, a reluctant admission of connection. The stark truth of his words hung in the air between them, a tangible thing, forging an unbreakable bond. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek, a touch so tender it sent a jolt through her, a startling intimacy in the desolate landscape. It was a fleeting gesture, gone as quickly as it appeared, but its impact was profound. In that raw, exposed moment under the vast, indifferent sky, their unspoken fears and hopes, their shared trauma and hard-won trust, coalesced into a profound understanding. The journey ahead remained uncertain, fraught with peril. But as the first stars began to pierce the twilight, a new dawn of quiet, fierce hope began to break within them. They were two disparate souls, forged in the crucible of the wild, standing on the precipice of an unknown future, their path now irrevocably linked, bound by the unwavering promise of resilience and a love as untamed and enduring as the wilderness itself.